Imagine waking up, not to an alarm but to the sound of a mule arguing with fate. That was Rome. And if you were 13 in the year 79 CE, just weeks before Vesuvius would cough ash over time itself, you weren't a child. You were inventory, valuable, yes, but expected to function like a small adult with slightly less facial hair and marginally more hope. Your name was Livia if you were a girl, Lucius if you were a boy, but it hardly mattered. The city had already decided who you'd be. By dawn, you were either weaving wool so coarse it whispered curses into your fingertips, or reciting Cicero in a dust-choked alley while a fishmonger screamed about yesterday's lies. There was no figuring it out. Rome didn't believe in potential, believed in utility. You wore your toga like a sentence, cumbersome, unforgiving, and designed to trip you in front of the very people whose approval you needed to survive. Your mother watched you practice walking without collapsing under its weight. Posture Marcus, she'd say, not unkindly, but with the quiet urgency of someone who knew a slouch could cost a dowry, a patron, a future. Across the courtyard, your sister adjusted her stola for the 6th time, pinning her hair into a coil so tight it ached. At 14, she was already being appraised like a rare vase. Does she listen? Does she blush prettily? Will she make trouble or make heirs? And yet, amid the noise, the judgment, the relentless expectation, you found moments, the baths steam-wrapped and echoing with gossip. The forum where you'd press yourself against a column just to hear a senator lie with such elegance it sounded like poetry. Street food bought with stolen coins. A glance held too long across the market square. Love in Rome wasn't whispered, it was shouted in sidelong looks and wax tablets passed under cloaks, always one misstep from scandal. But oh, how sweet that danger tasted when you were 13 and everything felt like destiny. Centuries later, in a castle perched on a hill soaked in mist and manners, another kind of performance began. Here, love wasn't about touching, it was about not touching. A knight would kneel in the mud before his lady's window, reciting verses about her eyelashes while her husband sharpened his sword to rooms over. This was courtly love, romance as theater, desire as discipline, longing as virtue. You didn't win the woman. You suffered beautifully in her name. She never asked for this, not really. But in a world where her marriage had been arranged before she could walk, where her worth was measured in land and lineage, being adored safely, publicly, poetically was a kind of power. So she smiled, distant and gracious, while the troubadour sang of her eyes being brighter than the morning star. In truth, her eyes were tired, her hands were calloused from estate ledgers. But let them dream, let them write. As long as the songs praised her virtue, she kept her reputation on her peace. The irony, everyone knew the rules were a farce. Love between spouses was dull, practical, necessary. Real passion, the kind worth singing about, had to be impossible, forbidden, unconsummated, and so Europe's nobility spent decades aching for people they barely knew, mistaking repression for refinement, obsession for honor. It was beautiful, it was absurd, and it shaped how the West still thinks about love, that it must hurt to be real, that distance makes desire noble, that the right person is always just out of reach. Now let's jump to a sunless parlor in 1872 London, where a different kind of silence reigned. Eleanor sat perfectly still on a chaise, her hands folded in her lap, her breath shallow. She hadn't laughed in months, not since the diagnosis, hysteria, a word that sounded clinical but felt like a cage. She'd merely said she felt tired, truly tired, bone deep, soul worn, but the doctor had written it down like evidence. Symptom expresses discontent with domestic duties, prognosis, moral weakness. Now she was under the rescue. No reading, no walking, no writing letters, no thinking too hard. She was to lie still, eat rich food, be massaged, and let her nerves reknit themselves in feminine tranquility. Her husband called it progress. Her mother called it necessary. But in her journal hidden beneath the mattress, written in stolen moments, Eleanor called it erasure. They didn't see her pain. They saw her as pain. They didn't hear her mind. They heard noise to be quieted. And when she dared to say she wanted anything, everything, even just to open a window, they called it nymphomania, not desire, disease. The worst part, she began to believe them, that her sadness was sickness, that her ambition was imbalance, that her body, with its secret longings and inconvenient cycles, was the enemy of order. So she swallowed laudanum like communion wine and let the fog take her. Better to be numb than to be wrong. This wasn't just Eleanor's story, it was the story of countless women, their very minds pathologized and their spirits prescribed into submission. It shows us how society, under the guise of medicine, can enforce its most rigid expectations. But let's go further back. Before Rome, before chivalry, before gaslit asylums, go to the rocky hills of Macedonia, where a boy stood astride a black stallion no one else could ride. His name was Alexander. He was 10, and already, the world seemed too small. His father Philip had forged an army from chaos. His mother Olympias had whispered into his dreams that he was born of Achilles and thunder. And his tutor Aristotle had asked him one morning, "Is it better to conquer the world or understand it?" Alexander didn't answer. He was too busy imagining both. While other boys played war, he studied it. While they dreamed of glory, he mapped it. He read Homer not for stories, but for strategy. He trained not to please his father, but to outshine him. And when rebellion broke out in the north and Philip was away, he didn't hesitate. At 16, he rode into battle not as a prince but as a force of storm in human form, precise, fearless, and utterly convinced he was meant for more than these hills. He didn't seek power. He assumed it, like breathing. There was no adolescence for Alexander, no phase of doubt. He was myth and muscle, philosophy and fury, all wrapped in a boy's skin. By 17, he'd already tasted command and found it sweeter than wine, sharper than steel. So what ties these lives together? A Roman teenager, a medieval lady, a Victorian woman, a Macedonian prince. Not time, not place, but expectation. Rome demanded maturity before the mind was ready. The Middle Ages demanded suffering as proof of love. Victorian England demanded silence as proof of sanity. And Macedonia, it demanded greatness before the beard had even grown. In every era, society has taken the raw, trembling thing called youth and pressed it into molds. Soldier, saint, wife, warrior, hysterical woman, noble sufferer, destined king. Some broke under the weight. Some bent until they snapped. But a rare few like Alexander, like the noble woman who wielded admiration like a scepter, like the Roman girl who spun wool and secrets in equal measure, learned to wear the mold like armor. They didn't reject the roles given to them. They rewrote them from the inside. And perhaps that's the real story of history, not just how the past shaped the young, but of how the young, quietly and fiercely, shaped the past. They found the cracks in the walls of expectation and planted seeds of their own. They remind us that even under the heaviest weight, there's always room for a little rebellion, a flicker of true self that can change everything. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey through time, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell for more stories like this. See you next time.